I'm Larry Waters. I'm a National Development Officer for the Society. It's really a pleasure to be here with you in Houston, Texas, which is, after all, the nation's fourth largest city. Of those of you who travel here from other states, we're very honored to have you. I'm sure you're honored to be in this great state. Our humility is only exceeded by our pride. Now, for those of you who are not fortunate enough to have been born in Texas, or at least to live here, you've probably been led to believe that we Texans are often loud and brash and not capable of using tact and finesse. That, of course, is pure liberal propaganda. For example, a Texas cowboy one day rode into a town on his beautiful white horse, tied up outside the saloon, and sauntered in for a few sarsaparillas. A little later, he staggered out to find someone had painted his horse a bright pink. Completely outraged, he rushed back in and yelled, "Who painted my horse pink?" A cowboy in the back stands up to about 7 feet and says, "I did, what of it?" Which our quick-witted friend said, "Sir, you need to know that the first coat is now dry." And that introduced our first speaker. This gentleman was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, received a BS degree in physics from Holy Cross College, served 3 years as a Marine Corps officer, began a career as an electronics engineer in 1960. In 1966, he left the engineering profession and accepted a full-time position with the John Birch Society. He served in a variety of posts, has been the organization's chief spokesman since 1973. In June of 1991, he was named president. He is a writer, a speaker, a film and television producer, an editor, and a radio and television spokesman. It's always a pleasure to introduce this outstanding patriot, John F. McManus.
Thank you very much. Somebody else in the audience that we want to introduce here, there's a young fellow here who now lives in Texas, and his name is Robert Welsh. He's absolutely the grandson of the founder of the John Birch Society, Robert Welsh IV. Where are you, Robert? There he is. And of course, a very proud member of the John Birch Society. I mentioned this at the afternoon session, and some of you are going to remember what I said. I suppose that a lot of you have heard that Vice President Gore invented the Internet. Did you know that Dan Quayle invented spell check? Did you know that Bill Clinton invented the lie protector? This fella Gore is really a piece of work. Somebody went out to dinner with him recently and noticed that he had a fish dinner. And they said, "Do you usually have a fish dinner?" "Oh, yes," he said, "I understand that fish is brain food." To which the fellow said, "There goes another theory." Now, I'm not supposed to be up here tonight to have everybody enjoying a few laughs, but I like to do that. But I'm here tonight to talk about the polls. My subject is the increasing use of opinion poll in our nation, and I begin by asking for a show of hands. I'd like a show of hands. How many in this audience would like to have a bumper strip with a simple message saying, "Nobody polled me"? Right? Look at that, huh? Look at that. Okay, thank you. See, now I can now report to the rest of the nation that I've taken a poll of hundreds of Americans, and I can report that in excess of 95% of the people that I've polled, and therefore 95% of the American people don't like opinion polls, plus or minus 4%. Now, you know that's not a reasonable conclusion. I haven't given a fair assessment of the response you gave. I didn't poll a representative cross-section of the public. I didn't frame the question objectively. And I had a conclusion seeking justification, no matter how ridiculous, to support my conclusion. So now you have a hint of how the public's attitude can be manipulated to produce results that may or may not be merited by the responses that are given. Even if a polling organization does a decent job of seeking to learn public opinion, the results they produced could then be falsely reported to the American people. Let me give you an example of a particular poll that was cited in a newspaper, in many newspapers, in fact, to favor the view of its editors, its publishers, and its owners, and so on. It was only a few months ago, a USA Today CNN Gallup poll reported that 81% of the American people believe that Clinton's presidency is a success. Now, you had to dig deeply to learn that this same poll showed that only 24% believed that the president is honest and trustworthy, and only 20% believed he provides good moral leadership. Now, how's that for a mixed result? 81% think he's doing a good job, and close to that same number believes him less than honest and devoid of good moral leadership. Author Ann Coulter said of this poll, "The president has lied to the country, his cabinet, his party, the press, his advisors, and his wife. He's lied to the public, he's lied in private, and he's lied on television." She said, "These aren't accusations. This is his story. But 1/4 of the public still insists that he's honest and trustworthy." Beyond the seeming schizophrenia exhibited by these results, what portion of this poll do you think was headlined by the overwhelmingly Clinton-favoring news media? You're correct. The reports told us that 81% believed the Clinton presidency a success. My good friend Joe Sobran has stated, "It would be interesting to know how many of those who defend Clinton in the opinion polls get income from the government." Or, as legal expert Jonathan Turley once put it, too many Americans seem to have decided that, quote, "criminal acts are to be negated by a good economy." It's very interesting to consider how the business of opinion polling ever got started. Its first known modern practitioner was a man named Vladimir Lenin. I say modern because a man named Pontius Pilate once polled the mob before him, and after confessing that he found no cause to punish Jesus, he succumbed to public opinion by releasing the mob's choice, a murderer named Barabbas, and delivering the God-man to be crucified. So much for polling a mob. Lenin used the polls to collect the gripes of a portion of the public. He then offered himself as the leader of the various causes they were complaining about, and he built a coalition of supporters. In America, two of the most famous pollsters in my lifetime, and this goes back a few years now, were George Gallup and Elmo Roper. We've all heard of the Gallup poll and the Roper poll. Gallup joined the Council on Foreign Relations in 1939, and Roper joined in 1944. Isn't that interesting? Polling today is sometimes done honestly, and also it is sometimes done dishonestly. A good example of dishonest polling occurred during the impeachment process when a poll was taken to learn how the people rated the Republicans for the job they were doing. The results showed Clinton opponents, the Republicans, in a very bad light. Now, if many of you in this audience or I had been contacted by a pollster asking that question, before we gave a response, how are the Republicans conducting the impeachment process? We would have immediately recalled such matters as illegal money flowing from China, illegal acquisition of personnel files, illegal firing of veteran employees of the White House Travel Office, and other crimes of Mr. Clinton that should have been part of the process and weren't. Our response, therefore, to the pollster would have been, "No, the Republicans are doing an awful job. They've left out all the good stuff." But no matter how much we might attempt to explain why we held such a position, all of us would have been marked down in the same column as any Clinton partisan who was angry because the Republicans were attacking their president. Our answer would have been taken as a pro-Clinton response. And didn't the media tell the nation over and over again that a large percentage of the American people did not support the way the Republicans were handling the case against the president? Why the lack of support wasn't even mentioned. What Americans must begin to understand is that some pollsters don't even try in the least to discover opinion. They work to shape it. And that's the key to knowing what many polls are all about. Let me give an example of how polls can be used dishonestly. In 1992, when George Bush's campaign for re-election was foundering, several of his aides suggested that he energize it by dumping Dan Quayle as his running mate. In his 1995 book called Call the Briefing, Bush press secretary Marlin Fitzwater revealed that at that point, 1992, Secretary of State James Baker and campaign manager Robert Teeter had secretly prepared a poll demonstrating that Quayle was a drag on the ticket. And according to Fitzwater, George W. Bush was in on the scheme, an operation one book reviewer termed as the Dump Quayle Conspiracy. Interesting word. The plot was never carried out, but that's not what's important in this discussion. What is germane is that these highly placed individuals plan to use a completely rigged poll. Can it be done? I just told you yes. Is it being done? I think you have a sense that it has been done. Some polls, however, do supply an accurate account of the public's view that conflicts with the establishment's agenda. These get very little press coverage. Earlier this year, for instance, the Zogby poll. Zogby is an honest pollster, Z-O-G-B-Y. If you see his name next to a poll, you can pretty much count on you getting a fair reflection of what the American people think about. Well, his polling firm found that 68% of its respondents believed that any tax cut should go to the taxpayers rather than remain in the hands of the government. And Zogby also found out by a 2-to-1 margin that respondents favored letting Americans keep money taken from them in Social Security taxation so they could make their own investments for their retirement. There wasn't too much coverage of those results. Of paramount importance here is that the Zogby firm asks questions only of people who say they vote. John Zogby also revealed what he termed, quote, the nasty secret of the business, unquote. And the nasty secret is that more than half of the people contacted by pollsters tell them to get lost and hang up. During the impeachment process, we were told over and over again that the president was favored by 65 or 70 or even a higher percentage of the people. Polling has become a substitute for thinking, for morality, for debate, for statesmanship, and for the constitutional process. A man named Richard Worthlin was Ronald Reagan's pollster. He now heads a firm in the Washington, D.C. area that does polling and conducts market surveys. He recently said, I have to smile when I see how much weight is putting on polling numbers. Especially in the middle of a crisis, approval numbers are about as stable as feathers in a tornado. That makes good sense. Only a few weeks ago, the Gallup organization conducted a poll asking the American people to rate post-World War II presidents as either successes or failures in foreign policy. Post-World War II presidents, 10 of them. Bill Clinton came out as the most successful. You might have seen that in your papers. Ahead of Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, and Bush. Clinton's friends in the media, meaning most of the media executives, columnists, and editorialists, gave it wide coverage. Clinton, a success in foreign policy. Let's summarize his record for just a moment. The foray into Somalia became a humiliation for our nation and a funeral for several American soldiers. Haiti remains a complete mess. There's no peace in Israel between Arabs and Jews, and there's just as much peace, none, in Northern Ireland between Catholics and Protestants. In Iraq, Saddam Hussein is still a threatening force. UN inspectors in Iraq, on whom our foreign policy geniuses place so much importance, have been exposed as inept or worse by one of their own. And stepped-up contacts with communist China have made it easier for Chinese bribery, Chinese espionage, Chinese continuation of human rights abuses, and the rising tide of Chinese exports that have created an enormous trade deficit with China. Americans who purchase Chinese goods, and it gets harder and harder not to do so, are financing the Chinese military buildup, courtesy of our nation's foreign policy, which has only become more harmful since the Clinton administration took over. We haven't even mentioned Kosovo, Yugoslavia. And this is the record that the pollsters tell us rates at the top with the American people. I'm for lowering the voting age to 45. There happens to be a very important postscript to this particular poll. After asking whose record they rated most highly, those who were polled were asked which 2 or 3 foreign policy matters facing the nation were the most serious. And by far, the most common response given was, I don't know. These are the people who were asked to rate presidents on foreign policy. What's the biggest problem we have in foreign policy? I don't know. And yet we're told that these people are representative of the American people. The individuals polled were hardly conversant with our nation's foreign policy and were hardly able to register an opinion. Yet the pollsters claimed that the opinion they gave is a reflection of what all Americans think. Gallup could have taken this poll rating of recent presidents. He could have taken it in a kindergarten. He could have taken it in a mental health sanatorium or maybe even the monkey cage at the local zoo. He would have gotten just as good a response. Another tactic used by the opinion shapers, who claim to be opinion discoverers, involves the use or non-use of related questions. If a pollster asks for an opinion of the president's performance, the response could be as high as 70% among people who consider only the fact that their paychecks keep arriving. But if a pollster first asks for an opinion about the president's behavior with Monica Lewinsky, and then follows with a question about the president's performance, the favorable rating plunges dramatically. You can see how they can shape a poll. Last January, the Zogby Company made the point that the strongest support for impeachment and removal of the president came from voters who were over 65, from people who had some college education, from those who lived in the South and the Great Lakes region, where those who were non-union members, and those who earned more than $75,000 a year. If you wanted a poll to show the other side of the impeachment process, you'd conduct it with young inner-city union members from the Northeast or Far West who have no higher education and are doing okay financially. Am I suggesting that this is what some pollsters do? You bet your life I am. Why wouldn't they? Some of them certainly have the goal of shaping the nation's opinion, not reflecting it. In 1997, 54 members of the U.S. House voted to get us out of the United Nations. Go for that. An official of the pro-UN United Nations Association of the USA claimed that he wasn't disturbed in the least by the fact that the vote was taken or that the number of those who supported the measure. I called this man and I asked him why he wasn't upset. He told me that 54 out of 435 congressmen represented only 13% of the total, and this was the same small percentage of the American people who favored withdrawal in a poll his organization had recently taken. In other words, there was nothing to worry about from his point of view. And so I went and obtained a copy of the poll. It turned out that the key question asked was whether the person being polled would be more likely or less likely to vote for the re-election of a congressman who favored U.S. withdrawal. They didn't ask whether you wanted us out of the UN or not. Would you favor or not favor a congressman who felt that way? Now, faced with a question like that, all sorts of other pluses and minuses could have shaped the response about your congressman. Was the congressman pro-life or pro-choice? Was he pro or anti-gun ownership? Was he for or against tax cuts? Maybe his stance regarding the UN would matter to the person being polled, but maybe it didn't matter to the person being polled, and he was just simply registering his opinion of his congressman. Now, who shapes the questions that the polling company goes and asks? The one who pays for it. If you want to conduct a poll, you go to a polling company, you write out the questions for them, and then they'll go out and they'll do the poll. So the pro-UN organization wrote the questions. The result of this poll of 1,000 persons showed that, yes, only 13% would definitely favor the re-election of a congressman who wanted the U.S. out of the UN. But 41% said such a position would make them less likely to vote. So 41 and 13 is only 54. What about the other 46%? Well, 39% of them said that their congressman's position regarding the UN wouldn't have any effect whatsoever on their vote, and 7% said they had no opinion. The UN USA group had tried to convey to me and others that all but 13%, 87% of the American people favored continued membership of the United States in the United Nations, but that's not what the polls showed. Not at all. In fact, the results showed that close to half could easily agree with us and with the 13% that liked the idea of the U.S. getting out of the UN. I later learned that these pro-UN activists visited the offices of each of the 54 who voted to get us out to tell them that they had made a terrible mistake and that their vote wasn't something that was a responsible vote, and that they had better take a close look at this important pro-UN literature we're leaving with you, Mr. Congressman, and so forth. The fact is, these pro-UN characters are terrified about our increasingly effective Get Us Out campaign. Good, right? The bottom line is that pollsters can lie, those who interpret polls can lie, and mass media spin doctors can use polls to lie. But at the same time, honest pollsters can tell the truth, honest interpreters of polls can be truthful, and occasionally even a newspaper or television reporter will convey a correct attitude about an honest poll. Which brings me to my final consideration about polls and pollsters. It is simply that the increasing reliance on polling is driving this nation away from the republic we were given toward the conspiratorial goal of democracy on the way to tyranny. There's an old saying which says, right is right even if no one says it's right. And that, of course, is John Birch Society thinking. But the American people are being stampeded into holding attitudes that are harmful, wrong, and morally reprehensible. They are also being buffaloed into thinking that they're all alone in holding views that practically no one else holds. The spreading attitude infecting our nation is that the majority can't be wrong, which is something about which the majority is definitely wrong. Majorities have hardly ever been correct. If we continue to allow ourselves to be polled about virtually everything, we might as well abolish the Constitution. We might as well abolish Congress. We might as well just survey the people every time an issue comes up. And isn't this precisely what H. Ross Perot called for? He's very big on computers, and he's already on record advocating that everyone in the nation should vote by computer on every issue. That's pure democracy, and it would spell the end of this nation. I think I've heard more than enough from Ross Perot. I prefer Alexander Hamilton, who said, "It has been observed that a pure democracy, if it were practicable, would be the most perfect government. Experience has proved that no such position is more false than this." Madison said, "Democracies have in general been as short in their lives as they are violent in their deaths," which is why our founding fathers didn't use polls. Once they put together the Constitution, they sent it to the state legislatures for ratification. But those state officials and the voters who elected them were property owners, taxpayers, informed citizens, and definitely not the type persons who could be steamrolled into expounding on anything without careful examination of the issue before them. The Constitution given us over 200 years ago sets down laws and does not allow for the whims of public opinion to rule the nation. We are supposed to be a government of laws, not a government of men who allow themselves to be influenced by polls. Polling is like television. Neither is inherently evil. It is how polls are used. It is how television is used that can make either a source of evil. When polls are used to shape opinion rather than reflect it, they become powerful weapons in the hands of evildoers. And yes, there are evildoers amongst us, tied together in a conspiracy designed to destroy our nation and make us their slaves. They use polls just as they'll use any other resource at their disposal to advance their foul agenda. We must help fellow Americans to become aware of this situation. More Americans must learn to say the following: I don't care what the pollsters tell us. I know what's right and I know what's wrong, and with the help of God Almighty, I'm going to see to it that right triumphs over wrong, no matter how many others get buffaloed temporarily or totally by those who would destroy my country. That's a little bit like saying that the emperor has no clothes, exactly when he indeed was stark naked. Someday in the not-too-distant future, someone will commission a poll, and he'll discover that the American people are profoundly grateful that there really was a John Birch Society that took the lead in exposing a foul conspiracy and led the nation back to less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world. Let's keep working, even working harder than ever, to make that day come very soon. Thank you.